together in prayer. Loving God, we give you thanks for the gift of this day. And we ask in these moments now that the words of my mouth, the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you alone are our strength and our salvation. Amen. Well, many years ago, I was attending a worship service in Nashville. An old seminary friend of mine happened to be there at the time, and it was a communion Sunday that day. So the time came in the worship service for me to scoot out of my pew and walk down the center aisle and receive the communion elements. Afterwards, I made my way back to the pew, and I was seated towards the very front of the worship area. And so it took some time for everybody else to be served. As I sat there, I simply took in the surroundings, the sound of music, the beauty of the stained glass. And then at one point, a gentleman caught my eye. As he made his way down the center aisle, it occurred to me that he might be somebody who perhaps lived on the streets. We make these assumptions about people at times, don't we? Based on how they look or what they're wearing. What I noticed is that after this man received the communion elements, he did not return back to his pew. After just a few moments passed, he was there walking down the center aisle again, headed towards the pastor to receive communion again. That morning, this man received communion 3 different times. After the worship service, my friend said to me, "You probably noticed Fred. He's a regular at our neighborhood outreach, and I reckon everybody comes to the Lord's table hungry, but some more so than others." And then my friend smiled and said, "And Fred happens to know that I give generous portions of communion bread." It's an interesting thing to ponder on any given communion Sunday. There's a song in our hymnal that sings, "You satisfy the hungry heart." And yet some people are hungry literally in their bellies. In today's gospel lesson, it is the disciples themselves who are hungry. And so they begin harvesting from the field where they are so that they can eat. Now, apparently, there is a problem. It is a Sabbath day, and one shall not work on the Sabbath. In Jewish law, there are 39 melachot, or forms of work, labor practices, tasks that you shall not do on the Sabbath. Plucking heads of grain and harvesting are among the forbidden tasks. The other problem is that these disciples don't go unnoticed. The Pharisees, they are good rule followers and law-abiding people, and some of them observe the disciples who are failing to honor the Sabbath. Oh yes, there is a problem, but it's not the one that I've always assumed. You see, used to, I think that the Pharisees were the problem. I saw them as rigid, law-abiding people who got in the way of Jesus' generous and grace-filled message of love. But biblical scholar Amy Jill Levine cautions us against such an easy, quick, and negative stereotype. Dr. Levine is a leading expert and scholar on the Gospels and the historical Jesus. And she also happens to be a devout, practicing Jew. She reminds us that it is the Pharisees who were the people who walked the walk and talked the talk. She also reminds us that they were a lay-led movement, and as such, they were concerned with equality. So they're not the problem. And when Jesus engages them in conversation, he is not suggesting that they dismiss the law. After all, Jesus himself was a faithful Jew, and he would have been practicing the laws of Sabbath keeping as well. What Jesus is doing here, when he engages the Pharisees in conversation, is that he is changing the subject. He reminds the Pharisees of other times when people have been hungry, and he reminds the audience that rightly values temple worship reminds them that people and relationships are of even higher value. I think back to that communion Sunday years ago. What is proper in terms of Holy Communion and how this worship practice is received and served? Many of us would consider circling back for seconds odd at best, and perhaps even sacrilegious at worst. And yet the living Christ in our presence changes the subject and asks us, what are you going to do about the people who are hungry among you? By my own observation, there are a great number of people who are hungry, physically, spiritually, and sometimes both. As we consider all that we have seen and experienced during this pandemic season, we are learning a lot. And I want to lift up just a couple of lessons today in light of the gospel, primarily rest and work. During the pandemic, it's true that many people began working from home, and it's been great for a lot of people. I myself can testify to the benefits of and even joy of working at home a bit more over the last couple of years. I remember last fall when my daughter was going to school online, I appreciated not having to get her up early and that mad rush of getting her clothed and fed and all ready for school with lunch packed and there at the schoolyard before the first bell rang. I liked hopping on Zoom calls with a decent shirt on the top and my pajama bottoms on the bottom that nobody could see. There are advantages to the blurring of this work-home life balance. In my house, I have to tell you, in my house, I think it is our dog who has benefited the most from us being at home more. But there are challenges too, and no doubt some of you have experienced those challenges yourself. One challenge is that people working from home are working longer hours, taking less vacation, and yet not as productive, according to multiple studies. This is no doubt related to sleep. Studies are also showing that in the United States, adults are averaging more sleep per day. However, those same studies indicate that we are experiencing an increase in the number of nights where we have disrupted sleep. And there is also an increase in the number of prescriptions for insomnia. You know, our Creator, in holy wisdom, designed a week, 7 days, with 1 day set apart for Sabbath. And when we fail to honor and keep our own ways of Sabbath keeping, we hurt ourselves and others. Another lesson, the challenge that not everyone has the option to work from home. Essential workers, they have had a pandemic experience that is quite different from those of us who are not essential workers. From grocery store workers to nurses, from janitors to teachers, there are a host of people whose work has always been essential. And these are often the very same people who are excluded from the relief, care, and protections that some of us take for granted. A recent article in a publication called National Domestic Workers Alliance reads like this: "It is time that we start thinking of what the essential workers need, instead of just expecting them to take care of our needs." That sounds to me like something Jesus would have said. And on this Labor Day weekend, like Jesus, we can start changing the subject. Yes, it's good to have a day off of work and to rest if you can, but let us not forget to engage in meaningful conversation about how we might support our essential workers. One simple thing that I'm trying to do more over these last several months is that when I go to a restaurant, I tip more generously these days. What might we do in little ways that can make a big impact in the life of somebody? what can we do as a church to provide for those who don't have rest? Labor Day was birthed in the industrial era and was characterized by a push for workers' rights and a protection against unsafe and exploitative working environments. Today, we can continue to lobby for worker rights. Sabbath. Sabbath doesn't invite us to rest. Sabbath commands it, but not so that we can have a spa day and lounge around. That's not necessarily a bad thing to do. But Sabbath keeping is about much more than that, much more than self-care. It is caring for creation and all creatures who are hungry. Amen.